back when I was in graduate school, my professor, Don Lavoie, coaxed me into attending a lecture by a very famous philosopher at the time entitled The Word, Spoken and Written. At the time, I think most of that talk went above my head. But in recent months, I've actually been thinking quite a bit about this, especially as I feel that the spoken dialogue within economics today in our public has deteriorated to some extent. And I started trying to remember this philosopher's talk about what it means to elevate the word in spoken and written form. And actually, and this is not hype, it's actually a real thing, is that one of the reflections on this that really has gotten me thinking is actually Russ Roberts himself, because I consider econ talk to be the ideal type of what we should hope in economic discourse or political discourse in our country intellectually. I was particularly driven by this in some recent conversations that Russ has had actually over the last year, including one with climate scientists and the debate that took place in that and the way that Russ negotiated that. And so I really do think econ talk has elevated and is a force for good in the way that we should think about having civil discourse and whatnot. But it's also true that if you look at Russ's written words, he also does that as well. There's no doubt that he has very strong priors, but he doesn't let those priors then cause the conversation to fall short, but instead uses it as a way to spur and elevate. If you look at this most recent book about how Adam Smith can change your life, which, by the way, there'll be copies available after the talk for you to purchase, and perhaps you can coax Russ into signing it. That might be a mutually beneficial exchange that Smith would approve of. So it's not from the benevolence of Russ Roberts alone.
The other book.
Yeah, if you would, that's true. I only see one book. Anyway, that's a different conversation. But how Adam Smith changed so well written, and yet at the same time subtle and learned, that you're just swept up in the intellectual journey with Russ, and I would add Adam Smith. And so I'm very excited about this panel today because we have three experts on Adam Smith to talk about the great works of Adam Smith, and particularly Adam Smith's great other work, which is the theory of moral sentiments. The way the panel will go is Russ Roberts will lead off and give us a talk for somewhere between 25 and 30 minutes, and then followed will be Ryan Hanley. We're going to just go in the order of the line here, and then my colleague Dan Klein. So Russ Roberts is currently I got to read this now. By the way, this is what happens when you get older. You got to switch glasses. So Russ Roberts is the John and Jean Denault Research Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He is the host of Econ Talk, as I just said, and he's the author of works such as The Price of Everything. It's a parable of possibilities and prosperity, which was published by Princeton University Press. He's a co-creator of the Keynes and Hayek rap videos. And on the Econ Talk, again, the guests have been legendary on that, including Joe Stiglitz and Thomas Piketty. Again, perfect examples of how Russ is a very civil and learned sort of debate interlocutor with these people. One of the great sort of losses for us at George Mason University is that Russ ended up by having a better option over at Hoover and ended up by leaving us, but we benefited greatly from his time with us. And before that, he was a professor at WashU in St. Louis and taught at Rochester, Stanford, and UCLA. Dan Klein, I'm just going to go down this, sorry. Skipping Ryan Hanley. Let me just skip. Okay, Ryan Hanley. Ryan Hanley is a professor of political science at Marquette University in Milwaukee. Before joining the faculty at Marquette, he was a postdoc fellow at Yale's Humanities Center. He is the author of Adam Smith and the Character of Virtue, and then the editor of the forthcoming Adam Smith, a Princeton Guide. He has been the past president of the International Adam Smith Society. And then Dan Klein is the Ginn Chair in Economics at the Mercatus Center and a professor of economics in our economics department, where he leads the program on Adam Smith. His teaching focuses on economic principles, public policy issues, and the liberal tradition of Adam Smith and F.A. Hayek. He's the author, most recently, of Knowledge and Coordination, A Liberal Interpretation, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2012. He's the founder and chief editor of Econ Journal Watch, which has become a main source for economic criticism in the economics profession. So without any further introductions from me, let me turn it over to Russ. And so please welcome Russ Roberts.
Well, thanks for those kind words, Pete. And I really loved being here. Back here, I loved being here. It's an incredible university and an even greater economics department. It's special in so many ways. And I appreciate you calling the panel a group of experts on Adam Smith. I see at least 5 people in the room, and I don't see everyone in the room well, but I see at least 5 people in the room who know more about Adam Smith than I do. But I'm happy to be 6th and let people think about who those other 5 are. But anyway, Adam Smith is the second best thing to come out of Scotland, and the first isn't golf. But I felt that way before I read The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and as I write in my book, I'm very grateful to Dan Klein, who approached me a long time ago, 5 years ago maybe now, and said, we ought to do an Econ Talk episode on The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And I thought, that's great, I've never read it, that'll be good for me. And as I write in the book, I regretted that for a while, because I couldn't figure out what The Theory of Moral Sentiments was about. But I pushed through and kept reading and eventually got something of the hang of it. And after 6 hours of conversation with Dan, 6 different Econ Talk episodes, I was a lot smarter, and Dan gave me amazing comments on the manuscript. So I'm very grateful to him, and I'm looking forward to Ryan Hanley's comments as well. But I do want to admit that Dan and I don't agree on everything about Adam Smith, so I'm looking forward to hearing what I still have to learn. My book's an attempt to make The Theory of Moral Sentiments accessible to a modern audience and apply those lessons to modern life. Most of those examples are about family, friends, work. And I'm going to summarize that briefly here. I hope you'll read the book. That'd be great. And ideally, you'll read The Theory of Moral Sentiments as well. How many people here have read The Theory of Moral Sentiments? Raise your hand. This probably is the only room in the greater Washington area today that has anything close to that proportion. I'm pretty confident about that. But what I want to focus on today are the lessons of Smith for how we think about ourselves as economists and policy advisors and as moral philosophers. So I'm going to do a little bit of, it's sort of a 2-pronged talk. Quick look at what The Theory of Moral Sentiments is all about, and then what I've been thinking about after having written the book and what its implications are for how we teach economics, think of ourselves as economists. In addition to my book, I'm going to draw on an Econ Talk episode that I did with Vernon Smith, my second favorite Smith. And I'll also draw on a recent paper I did at Econ Journal Watch. I'll quote from that in a couple places, and I'm happy to share that link with you. And of course, my email address is russroberts@gmail.com if you're interested in having a conversation afterwards, as well as in the hall. So in the early editions of The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and there are at least 5 people in the room can tell me how long this subtitle was there, but there used to be a subtitle, and it was an essay, very 18th century, an essay towards an analysis of the principles by which men naturally judge concerning the conduct and character first of their neighbors and afterwards of themselves. So the book is about how we feel about others and ourselves, our judgments of our character, our actions, our thoughts. He's interested in this book of, given how self-interested we are, why do we ever sacrifice our self-interest to help others? What motivates that behavior? How is it sustained? What gives us deep pleasure and satisfaction in life? How do we treat those around us? When my neighbor's in the hospital, why do I visit him? Why do I bring my neighbor food when she has a baby, even though we're past childbearing age? Why do I listen to my wife and I? Why do I listen to your boring story when I have better things to do? And more importantly, why do you listen to mine? Why do I turn down a lucrative consulting opportunity that I think is ethically a bit iffy? Now, these are questions which we all face in life, And there are many ways to answer these questions. Smith's answer, I would argue, is a very simple answer, which I push very hard in my book, maybe a little too hard, but he does mention it more than once, a few times. He says, man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. And by loved, he means respected, honored, praised, paid attention to. And by lovely, he means worthy of praise, praiseworthy, worthy of honor, worthy of respect, worthy of being paid attention to. And Smith, that's his very, if I were going to caricature, but I think fairly, his model of human behavior and how we interact with others, that's what's at the heart of it. How do we come to make decisions in those settings when we face conflicting uses of our time, when we face conflicting opportunities between ourselves and helping others? Smith says we imagine we have an impartial spectator perched on our shoulder, sitting, observing us, watching us, who does not have skin in the game, who is impartial. And unlike myself, he, as we look at our own actions, this person, this imaginary spectator, who is impartial, is going to make a judgment based on what is good and decent. And of course, I don't always listen to that spectator. Smith is very aware of the fact that we are prone to self-deception. The way I describe that is we want to be loved, so we want people to pay attention to us and respect us and honor us. We want to be lovely. We want to merit that respect, but we really are very prone to thinking ourselves as lovely even when we're not. So we're prone to self-deception. We're prone to overvaluing our positive attributes and undervaluing our negative attributes. And Smith's very aware of that. The famous story from Smith, of course, is the earthquake story, which I will repeat. How many people know the earthquake story? Raise your hand. So for those of you who don't, a quick story, but I mention it partly because it bothers me deeply how it's often misinterpreted. So Smith says he imagines two events. Event number one, you discover that millions of people have died in China in an earthquake. Event number two, you're told you're going to lose your little finger tomorrow. He says the first, you'll make some protests of sadness. You'll mention how sad it is. You might worry a little bit about a business that you have located there, that your firm is doing business there. You might give to charity to help the people if you could, and then you'll sleep like a baby. But if you're told you're going to lose your little finger, you'll probably toss and turn all night. And people usually end the story there and say, Smith thought he was so cynical, we thought we were self-interested. But of course, the rest of the passage says, if that's true, which is, I think, undeniably true for most of us, that we care much more about our little finger than we do about events that happen to strangers thousands of miles away, even in the world of cable television and the web. If that's true, then if I had a choice and I could save my little finger by killing millions of people, would I do it? And rationality would suggest you'd like to. And Smith says, but you won't. And he says, no one is that monstrous. We all understand that we have a natural impulse to see ourselves as the center of the universe. But if we act as if we are the center of the universe, we will not get very far in life. He says, though it may be true, therefore, that every individual in his own breast naturally prefers himself to all mankind, yet he dares not look mankind in the face and avow that he acts according to this principle. He feels that in this preference, they can never go along with him, and that how natural soever it may be to him, it must always appear excessive and extravagant to them. He then goes on to quote something which, as a Patriots fan, I find painful to read. In the race for wealth and honors and preferments, he may run as hard as he can and strain every nerve and every muscle in order to outstrip all his competitors. But if he should jostle, that is, jostle or bump into, if he should jostle or throw down any of them, the indulgence of the spectators is entirely at an end. It is a violation of fair play which they cannot admit of. This man is to them in every respect as good as he. They do not enter into that self-love by which he prefers himself so much to this other and cannot go along with the motive from which he hurt him. They readily sympathize, therefore, with the natural resentment of the injured, and the offender becomes the object of their hatred and indignation. Now, I go on to use the idea of the impartial spectator as a way that I don't know if all of us really use the idea of an impartial spectator, if we really conjure up what people will think of us if we behave in one way versus another. But I use this as a way that we as moderns can attain mindfulness being aware of what we do, aware of who we are. Smith says, of course, that if we saw ourselves as others see us, we would have a very painful time. And so we tend not to see ourselves as others see us. We see ourselves as we'd like to be seen. Now, Smith says there are two ways to be loved. He says we can pursue wealth, fame, and power. Those three things, he said, are what give people prominence. They give people attention. They cause people to be admired and respected and talked about. And when a person who's famous walks into a room, it's overwhelming. I use the example in the book. Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt, out of deep love for Adam Smith, came down the aisle here and sat down in the front, eagerly taking notes so they could learn more about Smith. My lecture would come to an end. No one here would be paying attention to me. Everybody would be trying to get a glimpse of them, including me. I would find myself drawn with my eyes, probably without even noticing it or wanting to see what they were up to. So Smith says this is an inevitable consequence of wealth, power, and fame. And as a result, we are seduced by it if we're not careful. That's one way to be loved. He says the second way to be loved, to get it to be respected and honored, is to basically be a good person. And he has two strategies for that. He has propriety and virtue. Propriety is the minimum standard. You have to do what's proper. You have to conform and harmonize with the people around you, meeting their expectations socially. Virtue, of course, is a higher standard. That means going out of your way to do something for other people. Typically, although he has three virtues I emphasize: prudence, that is, take care of yourself; justice, don't hurt other people; and benevolence, help other people when you can. Those are very high, difficult things to do. The justice is the easiest one. It's fairly easy not to hurt other people if that's your goal. Prudence is a little trickier, and of course benevolence or beneficence he talks about is very challenging. To help other people genuinely, as opposed to pretending to help them or wanting to help them, it is very difficult. But those are the virtues that I think we all understand are part of being a good person. And Smith says you have a choice. You can take the glittering path of glory, fame, and wealth. You can be ambitious, and he says, don't go there. That's a bad idea. Why the author of An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations should be as negative about wealth as he is in the Theory of Moral Sentiments is an interesting question we might talk about in after the presentations in Q&A. But Smith is very hostile to wealth, mostly in this book. It's certainly hostile to wealth as a goal. He's he says it's a fool's game. He says it doesn't make you happy. It's not the way to go. You'll be happier, and it certainly is very disdainful of celebrity, very disdainful of power, and he tells us that the way to get the good life is to be good, and that's the right way to be loved, is by being lovely and earning the love through your good behavior. And he talks a lot about how seductive those other paths are, and he counsels against them. To my mind, the most beautiful and maybe the most important example, the invisible hand in his writing, which of course is never, he uses the invisible hand twice, once in each of, in any sense related to what we use it. He uses it once in the Wealth of Nations and once in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. In neither case is he really talking, in my opinion, about spontaneous order. We'll see if my co-panelists agree or not. But he describes emergent or spontaneous order in his books often. And to me, one of the most eloquent ways he does that is he talks about how norms and civilization emerges from our interactions with each other, our desire to be loved and lovely, and how the sticks and carrots, the incentives, the prices that we pay for bad behavior and the rewards we get for good behavior get reinforced by those around us and signal to us how we should behave and act well. And that in turn creates the norms that we are reacting to simultaneously. He does that in about a page. It's a beautiful thing. It's just a wonderful thing. So here's a thumbnail sketch of Smith's view of how we view ourselves. This is a summary of what I've said so far. We're flawed. We're a mix of self-interest clashing with the desire for respect from those around us. We're prone to self-deception. We're easily seduced by money, power, and fame. We have a desire to be lovely, a desire to do the right thing, and loveliness, what is the standards of being lovely, emerge from the reactions and behavior of those around us. So this view of human beings, which I'd say is the center of this book, raises a lot of questions. One is, I'll just want to mention briefly the classic so-called Adam Smith problem. How do we reconcile that there seem to be two Smiths, one who says we're self-interested and one who says we act selflessly, and why don't those two themes show up in the other book? So there's not a lot about self-sacrifice in The Wealth of Nations, and there's not a lot about self-interest. There is some self-interest, of course, in the theory of moral sentiments, but it's not the focus. So my answer, which parallels Ronald Coase's and a little bit of Hayek, is that Smith's talking about two different spheres of human interaction. He's talking about trade at a distance in The Wealth of Nations, and he's talking about our intimate personal relations face-to-face in the theory of moral sentiments. And I'll expand on that a little bit in a second. The second question I want to ask, which I'm going to bring that back to, is what might economists learn about behavior from thinking about Smith's vision of our nature? So I want you to think about that for a sec. We've got the standard version of human behavior that comes out of The Wealth of Nations, which is human beings are self-interested. We have this other, I would assert other, you could maybe say they're not in conflict, but certainly is a seemingly different model of human behavior in the theory of moral sentiments, that we want to be loved and lovely. That does not seem to be the same thing as his model of human behavior in The Wealth of Nations. So my answer as to why they're different is, well, they're different spheres of activity. What's the implication of that for how we teach economics, how we think about public policy? So that's what I'm going to talk about in the rest of my remarks. So the usual answer is, well, we use self-interest when we talk about most spheres of economics. The demand for shoes, iPhones, haircuts. That's utility maximizing, demand curves, that's commerce, that's economics, so that's all about self-interest. I get on the internet to find a good deal. I'm not thinking about being loved and lovely, I'm thinking about getting a good deal. Then you would say, well, does that model apply when I want to think about how people behave, say, as a husband, as a father, as a neighbor? Does that same model of utility maximization, self-interest, cost-benefit analysis apply? Now, Vernon Smith says that's not the same thing. It's not just there's a different utility function when I deal with my family. What Vernon argues is that Deirdre McCluskey's vision of that first self-interest model, which is max U, maximization of utility. Max U, when you're max U, that person, maybe that applies for haircuts. But Vernon really says, it's not just that I have a different set of things in my utility function when I interact with my family. What Vernon argues, and I think he's right, is when I'm dealing with the internet or going to the mall to buy shoes, I'm thinking about what's in it for me. Okay? Think about that. What's in it for me? Self-interest. What's in it for me? I'm looking for a good deal. But Vernon says that when we're in small groups, the world of the theory of moral sentiments, it's not, this is a tricky concept of Vernon's, but I think I get it. It's not about behavior, it's about conduct. It's not about maximization, it's about conformity to the unwritten rules that emerge from our interactions. Sure, it's about what's in it for me, because that's embedded in my DNA. But it's also about my awareness that when I'm interacting with other people, I have to temper my self-interest, and I do that by following rules of conduct. These rules emerge from the bottom up, the way we treat those around us to create harmony in our interactions with others. And my analogy is it's the difference between a basketball game and dancing with a partner on a crowded dance floor. So think about those two extremes. We have a basketball game over here, and we've got a dance going on over here. Both involve cooperation, right? You got teamwork, and you got partners dancing over here. Both have competitive aspects. The team's trying to score, trying to play well. Over here, I might be trying to show off what a great dancer I am, or not humiliate myself with what a lousy dancer I am. But on the dance floor, I'm focusing on what is appropriate behavior, what is proper, which is not stepping on my partner's toes and not banging into other people on the dance floor. I don't mind being the best dancer. That might be a bonus. I might even try to show off a little bit. But my focus isn't on proving that, or I'll be a very unattractive dance partner. Consider a different kind of dance, marriage. If my goal in marriage is to get as much as I can out of my marriage, I won't be a very good husband. Can you model a marriage as maximizing utility? Of course you can. Does it capture what I'm actually doing? When I offer to drive carpool when my wife needs some help, when it's her night to drive carpool and she says, can you help out? Do I sit down and say, well, this will be good for me because that means on Saturday night we can go to that movie that I like? Is that what's really going on? I would argue it could be. And it could be you could assume that's what's going on. But if it's actually what's going on, it's not a very good marriage. That's my claim. And in general, most of us believe deep down that what we're trying to do in the marriage is not to get the most out of the deal and not to take advantage of our spouses. There is a non-trivial part of human behavior where I focus on doing the right thing, even to my detriment. I want to be a good husband. I want to be a good father. Or at least where expectations about what is proper or virtuous clash with my self-interest. I may fail. I may choose the selfish thing. I may fool myself about what my real motives are. And yes, I know I can assume that doing the right thing is what makes me happy, and that's an uninteresting tautology that fools me into understanding that I understand it. Now, one reaction to this claim that there are two modes of behavior in between dealing with strangers in commercial dealings versus dealing with people near me is that this is interesting, this Smithian stuff about respect and being a good husband and honor and conduct and conforming. That's nice, but that's not what most economists look at. 95%, 99% of what we look at, it's self-interested stuff. It's the demand for iPhones, it's Uber, etc. And Smith was able to write The Wealth of Nations without referring much to the sympathetic aspects of our nature. This suggests that the richer view of human nature espoused by Smith in the Theory of Moral Sentiments adds little to economics. Oh, it's fine for psychology. And then, that's not what economics is, though. Demand for oil, international trade, too big to fail. That's what we do. And that's self-interest. That other stuff, that's psychology. That's sociology. That's not us. We don't need to do that. Oh, there might be somebody who does it as a special imperialistic economist like Gary Becker, who I'm going to mention again in a minute. But that's like a flaky, kooky thing. You don't need that to do all the other stuff that we care about. To further defend the mainstream view, which I'm rebelling against in this talk, but to further defend the mainstream view that we don't need the Smith of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, one could argue that all the implications of the richer Smithian model can be, I'll call it perspective because it's not a model, of the richer, at least in the formal sense, all the implications of the richer Smithian model can be gotten by just manipulating the utility function. If people care about their relationship with others, we'll put it into the utility function. We'll explain why people might be willing to sacrifice personal well-being that way to help others. In this model, I bring food to the family of a newborn even when I no longer expect additional children. Without expected reciprocity, I expend real resources and gain a feeling of belonging, and that's good. That's my self-interest. Now, my early work on charity took this approach. Much of Gary Becker's work was an attempt to enrich the more sterile versions of Homo economicus as a self-interested maximizing machine. Becker managed to maintain the richness of human behavior while keeping the formal models of utility maximization under constraints. His artfulness is rare, however. Now, whether this approach is productive of jamming everything into the utility function and maintaining the standard toolkit of modern economics is an interesting question. I'm going to put that to the side. Instead, I want to speculate on how the very style implicit in the two approaches, the Max-U approach of utility maximization under constraints and Smith's emphasis on conduct and conforming to the rules that emerge, the norms of society, has implications for economists. Now, the truth is, we're not just interested in predicting behavior. We pretend that's the case. Sometimes we pretend we're just scientists, and we may even fool ourselves into thinking that's the case, and there may even be economists for whom that's true. I can think of one. I'm not going to name him. I know one economist who I think doesn't have any ideology, he's not philosophically oriented, and he's just interested in humans. He doesn't really have a desire to make the world a better place. But that's very rare. Most of us care about two things. We care about how people behave and understanding it, and we care about using that understanding to make the world better. Does utility maximization really describe the world? Does it really describe what brings us lasting satisfaction? Does it matter that it's realistic or not? Or is it sufficient to assume that we act as if we're maximizing the Milton Friedman defense? Now, Robert Frank has argued that teaching economics makes you selfish. The way we teach economics causes people to be amoral at best or immoral. I don't know if that's true, but I do think that even economists confuse what is rational or self-interested with what is moral. Now, Paul Fleiterer, who's a finance person at Stanford, has a fascinating paper called Chameleons that I recommend to those who are interested in these kind of issues, where he argues that in finance in particular, we have confused our models with reality and used them to make predictions for good public policy that have no basis in science. That basically by making an incredibly unrealistic model that has certain characteristics and certain parameters, we then come up with the ideal parameter that would then maximize welfare, forgetting the fact that the model itself is not capturing what is actually going on in the financial sector. It's a very provocative work. It's an attack on this idea that as if models are sufficient. Does our focus on utility maximization and calculation mislead us about the fundamental sources of human satisfaction? My speculation is that if you are trained to see human beings as something akin to calculating machines, if your research sees them as calculating machines, and if you teach your students to view them as calculating machines, it is inevitable that some of that perspective will affect how you view public policy. The dominant view of economists is that the economy is a mechanism that we as economists are able to configure via the levers and dials of public policy to improve on the outcomes that emerge from the private choices of individuals. This is the worldview behind monetary policy, fiscal policy, Pigovian taxes, subsidies, antitrust, and various paternalistic restrictions on diet and our leisure choices. This view is so dominant that public policy should be used to improve people's lives based on our understanding of how people behave and what makes them tick, that we rarely question where it comes from. What is the basis for the view that the policy suggestions of economists can improve matters? Well, our theories, of course, but do our theories actually capture what's going on? Why are we so sure? Perhaps some of the hubris of our policy advice comes from our mechanistic view of human nature, the simplicity of calculating the combination of goods and services that maximizes utility, and that creating more utility is a mathematical calculation, an engineering problem with a solution. If we human beings get our deepest satisfactions from things other than material stuff, welfare economics, as it is traditionally constructed, is meaningless. So where does that leave us? And I'll wrap up. I was trained at the University of Chicago. If I could travel back in time and put my old self into the audience today listening to this talk, I would be disgusted. I would dismiss this talk as ridiculous, unimportant, and silly. I would argue that the self-interested models of utility maximization are very powerful. It leads to useful predictions. I would call this kind of talk an attack on neoclassical economics. It's stuff we all know already, and I'd go on about my business. I would argue that it's just a failed version of behavioral economics. It's failed to provide a useful alternative to rational choice, and that experimental settings are not how people make real-world decisions in markets, and I'll keep my Max U approach. Thank you very much. Part of me still thinks that. But then there's Smith. Should I just ignore the insights of Smith about face-to-face interactions? How should I think about growth, assuming we even understand how to create it? Is development in impoverished places that reduces the role of fellow feeling always a good thing? I confess to being drawn to the view that human flourishing is what we should care about, that what brings deep satisfaction is respect and interacting with others, what we're doing here today, and that money is overrated, or at least more of a necessary but not sufficient condition for flourishing. Most of the interest in flourishing comes from the left, from Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum. They want to empower the government to solve the problem, a problem that government's very inadequately designed to solve. Government doesn't do flourishing very well. See schools, public, though we're sitting in one. What government, at least at the K through 12 level, what government is good at is killing people and taking one group of people's money and giving it to another group. They're not so good at figuring out what makes us sing, that gives life soulfulness. My worry is that our methodology as economists may be encouraging us to see human beings as pieces on a chessboard whose motions and workings we purport to understand, and that in turn makes us prone to be men and women of system, with an overconfident vision of what will serve to improve the well-being of the chessboard we are managing. The Smithian view of man encourages a humbler approach to human welfare. We are complicated creatures, we human beings. The road to improvement isn't as well mapped as we may like to believe, and recognizing the complexity of human motivation should make us more humble about our ability to intervene in private choices in a way that is welfare enhancing. There's a Smithian perspective that makes money secondary to things like using your talents, joining with others to create great stuff, whether it's products or whether it's social movements, earning respect. Maybe those of us who believe in smaller government might find such an approach appealing to those who are less sympathetic to, say, tax cuts. We should be humble about what we don't know, and perhaps even more humble about what we think we do know. That is what I think is the real lesson from thinking about Smith in a modern context. Thank you very much.
Hey, Ryan, you're up.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Pete, and thanks very much both to Mercatus and to George Mason for hosting this wonderful event. So, can reading a book really change your life? Russ Roberts thinks it can, judging from the title of his work, and in so thinking, he turns out to be in pretty good intellectual company. No less a thinker than Henry David Thoreau once marveled at precisely the same phenomenon, exclaiming in Walden, quote, "How many a man has dated a new era in his life from the reading of a book," end quote. So the sort of project in which Robert seems to be engaged in his book has been around for a fairly long time, at least since before the American Civil War. At the same time, to realize how venerable and indeed ancient this project is may be to realize how difficult it is to pull off this project today. Think of the sort of conditions of life in which Thoreau wrote his own book that sought to change men's lives. Antebellum Concord, I suspect, was a relatively quiet and sleepy sort of place, certainly not the greater Boston commuter suburb it's since become. But even then, Thoreau had to get out of town and to retreat back to his shack in the woods. Life-changing reading and life-changing writing, he knew, are no ordinary activities, but ones that take focus and leisure and quiet. Yet focus, leisure, and quiet are precious and rare commodities today, and I suspect few people know this better than Roberts himself. His own reading of the theory of moral sentiments, he tells us early on, was prosecuted in part at the halftimes of soccer games. Moreover, Roberts knows that he's not just a busy man himself, but that he's writing for an equally busy audience. Indeed, one of the main goals of his book, he tells us early on, is to make Smith's life lessons accessible to busy people. In his words, quote, "To give you Smith's insights and some of the best of his writing, just in case you don't get around to reading all of the original," end quote. So his aim, as he says, is to put Smith into, quote unquote, digestible form, and indeed a form that is, quote, more accessible than the original. Now, I can't but enthusiastically endorse this ambition. Like Roberts, I think the more Smith the world can get, the better off it's likely to be. It's thus wonderful to see that this book does for the theory of moral sentiments something of what P.J. O'Rourke's book did for The Wealth of Nations, and what Nick Phillipson's recent biography has done for Smith the Man. That is, it paints an attractive, approachable portrait of the man and his work, rendering each accessible to audiences who may not have the resources or inclination to study the texts themselves. Now, insofar as I make my own living as an academic specialist on Smith, I realize I'm clearly not the target audience for these books. But I'll still make bold to say that Roberts pulls off this project extremely well. Reading his book, I was continually impressed by his remarkable ability to translate 18th century examples into a 21st century perspective. Indeed, one of its finest moments is its opening recasting of Smith's earthquake in China passage into a busy modern office setting. So to anyone who's ever taught at any level will absolutely delight in Roberts' illustration of flattery via his portrait of those all too familiar students who gushingly proclaim how much they loved our classes even as they're turning in their blue books at the end of the semester. As these and many other examples attest, Roberts is a keen observer of everyday life, much like Smith himself, and indeed one who has a real facility of pitching his observations in a way that will captivate his audience, again, much like Smith himself. Now, all that said, I take it that Roberts' goal, though, isn't simply to update Smith or make him relevant for our times. As his title says, he wants to show us that reading Smith can, in fact, change our lives. But what does this mean? In large part, it seems to mean that reading Smith can help us live good lives by providing us with some useful practical wisdom about how to navigate life's most familiar challenges. As Roberts says, quote, Smith tells his readers what the good life is and how to achieve it, end quote. Now, some specialist readers of Smith might balk at this description. Smith himself is rarely quite this direct, they might say. But Roberts, to his credit, sticks with this and uses this as a very helpful organizing principle for the book. Take, for instance, his chapter titles, chapters that include, among others, ones on, quote, how to be happy, and, quote, how to be loved, and, quote, how to be good. These promise quick wisdom on big questions, and indeed not just wisdom in an abstract head-in-the-clouds sort of sense, but rather in a much more practical news-you-can-use sort of sense. Indeed, in Roberts' hands, Smith comes off less as a moral theorist than a practical moralist, that is, less like his friend David Hume, author of dense philosophical treatises and enquiries. Then he comes off like Hume and Smith's mutual friend Benjamin Franklin, himself the quintessential self-help author of the Enlightenment. And this, it should be noted, is itself a time-honored way of reading Smith and TMS. Before he was elected president, Woodrow Wilson, as a Princeton lecturer, once told his students that Smith, quote, stores his volumes full with the sagest practical maxims, fit to have fallen from the lips of the shrewdest of those Glasgow merchants in whose society he learned so much, end quote. And well before Wilson, Smith's first biographer, Dugald Stewart, said much the same thing, observing of TMS that, quote, with the theoretical doctrines of the book, there are everywhere interwoven with singular taste and address the purest and most elevated maxims concerning the practical conduct of life, end quote. So here again, Roberts is in good company. But that last line from Stewart might give us reason to pause. Like Stewart, Roberts finds a good deal of practical wisdom and solid good sense in TMS. But Stewart also feels compelled to mention that there are in TMS certain quote-unquote theoretical doctrines. Now, Roberts' book, from start to finish, is clearly after something other than these theoretical doctrines. But their absence might lead one to wonder what we might miss if we read TMS strictly as a storehouse of practical maxims without also casting an eye on its theory. And I confess that if I have even a little mild unease with Roberts' book, it would be here, that is, its relative silence on the theory. And by this, I don't want to suggest that Roberts ignores the theory. Roberts, in fact, does an excellent job of introducing us into a quite concise and compelling way to Smith's thoughts on sympathy and spectatorship and virtue and judgment, among other topics. Instead, my concern here is that if we focus only on Smith's practical morality, without also some appreciation of Smith's theoretical reasons for treating practical morality in the first place, we may come away with a rosier picture of what that practical morality looks like. Indeed, a rosier picture than what Smith himself might have recognized. Let me try and be a little more specific at what I mean here. Take, for example, Roberts' account of how Smith understands the good life. On this front, Roberts says that for Smith, quote, getting the most out of life means choosing wisely and well, or as he says, quote unquote, making good choices. Now, as an assessment of what it means to get something good out of life, this may well be true. But I confess that when I read it, I thought less of Adam Smith in TMS, who, so far as I know, never says anything quite so direct as that, than of Jamie Lee Curtis in Freaky Friday, who delivers just those words in a lovely scene designed by the filmmakers as a send-up of classic bad parenting. The key point here is that in clarifying Smith's lessons in this way, we may run the risk of making him slightly more direct than he was inclined to be, and perhaps also run the risk of losing sight of some of his insights into why it is that making good choices is so difficult for so many today amidst the challenges of commercial modernity. And so herein lies what I would like to do, turning briefly to Smith's own text. It seems to me that there are certain aspects of living well and becoming virtuous that Smith focuses on somewhat more than Roberts does. Case in point is what Smith has to say about benevolence. One of the most important discussions in Roberts' book concerns Smith's understanding of how much good can really be done by pursuing self-interest on the aggregate, and how much evil, in fact, is often done by politicians who claim to be acting benevolently. This is a crucial Smithian teaching, and Roberts conveys it, I think, quite brilliantly and powerfully. But there's also another side to benevolence in Smith, and we don't get quite as much of that here. It's a side that comes out with particular power into what, to my mind, is one of the most striking passages in the entirety of Smith's corpus. And if you'll indulge me for one brief second, I'd like to read a brief passage from Theory of Moral Sentiments. This is 2333, if you're thumbing along in your copies here. Quote, "Man was made for action, and to promote by the exertion of his faculties such changes in the external circumstances both of himself and others as may seem most favorable to the happiness of all. He must not be satisfied with indolent benevolence, nor fancy himself the friend of mankind, because in his heart he wishes well to the prosperity of the world, that he may call forth the whole vigor of his soul and strain every nerve in order to produce those ends which is the purpose of his being to his advance. Nature has taught him that neither himself nor mankind can be fully satisfied with his conduct, nor bestow upon it the full measure of applause, unless he has actually produced those ends." Now, this is striking stuff, especially coming from Adam Smith, of all people. But it's a key part of Smith's story of precisely what a human being is, and just what purpose our lives on this earth may have. And as such, I'm sorry not to see a bit more of it in a book that otherwise so courageously and insightfully treats this side of Smith's project. In a similar vein, I was very pleased to see in Roberts' book his focus on the figure that Smith calls the quote-unquote wise and virtuous man, who Roberts quite rightly recognizes as the very embodiment of the moral ideal to which Smith thinks we ought to strive. But at times I wondered whether Roberts emphasizes quite enough just how challenging Smith himself thought the pursuit of wisdom and virtue is. Here's one thing that Smith says about the wise and virtuous man, and indeed how he comes to form his ideas about virtue. Quote, "In the wise and virtuous man, these ideas have been made with the most acute and delicate sensibility, and the utmost care and attention have been employed in making them. Every day some feature is improved. Every day some blemish is corrected. He has studied this idea more than other people. He comprehends it more distinctly. He has formed a much more correct image of it and is much more deeply enamored of its exquisite and divine beauty." End of quote. That's from TMS 6325. Now, this is clearly pretty demanding stuff on Smith's account. Becoming truly wise and virtuous, we're told, requires the quote-unquote most acute and delicate sensibility, quote-unquote the utmost care and attention. That is strenuous observation, day in and day out work, careful study and understanding. This is a somewhat different emphasis, though, certainly than what we get from Roberts. Roberts is quite wonderful at calling attention to all the little improvements we can and should make around the margins of our lives, and which added up are likely to make us better and happier, becoming more patient, becoming more mindful, becoming kinder and gentler. These are clearly all changes that Smith himself would endorse. But the pursuit of wisdom and virtue seems for Smith to demand more than just tweaks at the margins in our spare time. As he sees it, pursuing virtue is some sort of full-time job. With that in mind, let me close by coming back to the beginning. When I read TMS on just how hard the pursuit of wisdom and virtue is going to be, among other things I think of is, in fact, again, Thoreau. In that same chapter in which he describes how many have dated new beginnings in life to encounters with books, Thoreau also insists that reading such books in the right and necessary sort of way is hard, indeed harder today than ever. So here's Thoreau, quote, "The heroic books, even if printed in the character of our mother tongue, will always be in a language dead to degenerate times, and we must laboriously seek the meaning of each word and line, conjecturing a larger sense than common use permits, out of what wisdom and valor and generosity we have," end quote. Now, this is hard stuff again, and both Smith and Thoreau knew that most of us just aren't going to be up for it, whether because we lack the time or the inclination or the dedication or the patience. And if that's true, how likely is it today that readers are going to change their lives because of an encounter with a book, even at first hand? My suspicion is that such an encounter is unlikely to be of the sort necessary in order to teach bad men to be good or good men to be great. But in the end, that's probably okay. Roberts, I suspect, is probably less concerned to make bad men good or good men great than to make those who are already decent just a little bit better. And this seems to me not only a wholly laudable goal, but also one that Smith himself would likely recognize and support as fundamental to his vision of a flourishing commercial society. Seen thusly, changing one's life means not the reinvention of oneself, but rather an openness to being ready and willing to take practical steps that might enable us to become a little better, a little calmer, a little happier than we are now. For doing so much to contribute to this worthy project, Robert certainly has my thanks, and I'll go so far as to dare to presume would very likely have earned Smith's thanks as well.
Russ's book, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, comes across, as Ryan's remarks highlighted, as a self-help book. Now, you might suspect Russ of disguising a political book, specifically a classical liberal book, as a self-help book. But it is a self-help book. I'd say it's both a self-help book and a liberal book. The book suggests how you can improve your own life, and one of the suggestions is to utilize liberal principles in making your pursuits. The thrust is not to make liberal causes your causes, but to make your pursuits in light of liberal wisdom, conditioned by liberal wisdom. Russ suggests that you accept commercial society and that you center your pursuits in voluntary, peaceful realms of life: family, church, neighborhood, work, play, commerce, in realms of life where we can take part in honest cooperation, relatively free of corruption. The book is political in that, for the most part, the questions in life, the big questions, the most important questions of meaning, validation, identity, duty, community, the book says, be very wary of political answers to those questions. I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble moving this. The economics of the book lies chiefly in explaining that your duty to serve your fellow human beings, like in the passage you just read, Ryan, very often has no better way to proceed than for you to pursue honest income. Russ's approach is to share his own encounter with the theory of moral sentiments, just as you started today, about how when you first got started, you felt a little lost. It was really exciting, actually, to be with Russ on this journey. I also got to read the book in manuscript, so it really is, his approach really is to share his own encounter with the book. And a book like Russ's could be written only by someone who had had an encounter like he had the courage to write about it, and had the ability to do so effectively. I don't know who else could have written such a book, honestly. If you want to read TMS but find it daunting, start with Russ's book. You will hear his experience with the work. Russ's book is like a pathway to TMS. I'm very hopeful that it'll, over many years, maybe not like a fast splash book, but over many years will lead people into TMS. It acquaints you with the central ideas, and I have to say, young people today are fortunate to have Russ's book to take advantage of. I really wish I had had it when I was young. Here, I thought I would make a few remarks, actually more about TMS than about Russ's book, so in this way mine are a little different than Ryan's comments, but relate those remarks back to Russ's book. Russ quotes Smith on self-deceit. This self-deceit, this fatal weakness of mankind, is the source of half the disorders of human life. So self-deceit seems to be a big source of vice and disorder. But Smith also points to another source, namely faction and fanaticism. Of all the corruptors of moral sentiments, therefore, faction and fanaticism have always been by far the greatest. So faction and fanaticism are the greatest, and self-deceit is the source of half. So it sounds like the sources of trouble are pretty much covered here. And by the way, related to faction and fanaticism, Smith also says, maybe this is kind of a separate category, false notions of religion. False notions of religion are almost the only causes which can occasion any gross perversion of our natural sentiments in this way. And that principle, that is one's own sense of the deity or God's validation, which gives the greatest authority to the rules of duty, is alone capable of distorting our ideas of them in any considerable degree. Okay. But wait, he adds the following: overrating the difference between one permanent situation and another. The source of both the great misery and disorders of human life seem to arise from overrating the differences from one permanent situation and another. Now he seems clearly to have surpassed the ceiling of 100% in his account of the vices and disorders of human life. And there's more. Smith speaks of people failing to show reserve and burdening people with their own experience. And it is for want of this reserve that the one half of mankind make bad company to the other. Oh, and he comments on the admiration of the rich and powerful. This disposition to admire and almost worship the rich and powerful, and to despise, or at least to neglect, persons of poor and mean condition, is the great and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments. And by the way, on this head, he advises, never come within the circle of ambition, nor ever bring yourself into comparison with those masters of the earth who have already engrossed the attention of half mankind before you. Well, it seems pretty clear that Smith's past 200% in his account of vice and disorder, but actually there's more. Smith writes of the ambitious pursuit of place, and thus place, that great object which divides the wives of aldermen, is the end of half the labors of human life, and is the cause of all the tumult and bustle, all the rapine and injustice which avarice and ambition have introduced into this world. Where are we now? 300%? Well, there's two more. Pleasure and groundless applause. To be pleased with groundless applause is properly called vanity, and is the foundation of the most ridiculous and contemptible vices, the vices of affectation and common lying. And then the propriety of our moral sentiments is never so apt to be corrupted as when the indulgent and partial spectator is at hand, while the indifferent and impartial one is at a great distance. So he's, pushing 400%. Let's review the sources: self-deceit, faction and fanaticism, false notions of religion, overrating the difference between one permanent situation and another, want of reserve, disposition to admire the rich and powerful, the pursuit of place or status, pleasure and groundless applause, and the impartial spectator being at a great distance. So it seems like he's double counting or triple counting or quadruply counting. So the overage, some of it anyway, can be chalked up, of course, to exaggeration and style. But there are two other ways to see the matter. First, to explain a vice or a disorder, Smith might be giving not only explanations, but explanations of the explanations. So if we're starting off with a vice, we might say that, when you see people do that kind of thing, 50% of the time it comes from this. And this, some 50% of the time it comes from this. And this, some 50% of the time, or whatever percent, it comes from that. Okay, so to call that layering, there's many layers to account for, not just one layer. A second way to make sense of Smith is lenses. That is, to see each source of vice as a lens. So when Smith says that self-deceit, quote, is the source of half the disorders of human life, we might read that as half the disorders of human life can be fruitfully interpreted through the self-deceit lens. And that doesn't mean that the same disorders can't also be fruitfully interpreted through, say, the faction and fanaticism lens, or the want of reserve lens, or any of the other lenses. So, for example, take the action of some guy, Joe, say, circa 1918, who helped promulgate, who was an activist for the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which imposed prohibition. This amendment passed in 1920. Joe's activism for prohibition, obviously vice, in my view, might be usefully viewed through several of the 9 lenses. Think about it. You got Joe, the prohibitionist, pushing this. Yeah, maybe it'd be good to think about that in terms of his self-deceit, maybe in terms of faction and fanaticism, false notions of religion, overrating the difference between one permanent situation and another, want of reserve for sure, disposition to admire the rich and powerful, maybe, the pursuit of place or status, yes, maybe, pleasure in groundless applause, and the impartial spectator being at a great distance. So in reading Smith, I think that we should read him as offering layers and lenses, not neat schemes that make things line up to make a grand total of 100%. I've talked now about sources of vice and disorder. Now let's turn it around to virtue. I think the same reading applies. For virtues, too, we have layers and lenses, not a neat scheme that makes a grand total of 100%. And here I voiced a small reservation about Russ's book. Russ says that, quote, Smith tells us how to lead the good life, that Smith offers a roadmap to happiness, goodness, and self-knowledge. He writes, quote, virtue is multifaceted for Smith, but his big three, as Russ mentioned in his remarks today, are prudence, justice, and beneficence. These are the traits that make us lovely. These moments in Russ's book, smack a bit of the neat scheme image of virtues, rather than seeing Smith as offering a plexus of layers and a set of different lenses. I'm really not sure that I'd say that TMS, quote, tells us how to lead the good life. I'm more comfortable saying that it helps us in pursuing the good life by telling us what not to do. In my view, TMS, while exoterically a book principally about life among equals, like you and your neighbors, is also, and partly esoterically, a book about politics, a liberal book about not looking to politics for answers, and about the moral tragedy of governmentalizing social affairs. I think it is very important to realize that some of the main distinctions he makes between the sets of virtues, but some of the categories of virtues that he sets up, are made so as to advance liberalism as opposed to being made so as to create a checklist of virtues and a guide to practicing them. The sets of lenses that he offers are fashioned, in other words, sometimes to teach lessons in politics, not lessons in private morals. And just as we had the vice example of Joe, the prohibitionist, a concrete example may illustrate virtue as lenses. Consider the act of writing How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life. Definitely a virtuous act. But think how we can apply the different virtue lenses. In one respect, the act was the author's practice of prudence. In another respect, courage, definitely. In another respect, industriousness. In another, beneficence. Maybe more specifically, generosity. And in another, perhaps gratitude. Russ's gratitude to Adam Smith. Many virtues, many layers, many lenses. And gratitude is an appropriate sentiment to conclude with. We have much reason to be grateful to Russ for a truly remarkable contribution to learning about Adam Smith. Thank you.
So we have some 25 minutes or so for open for Q&A. There is a mic here. If Justin, go ahead and do it. Direct your questions.
Can I have 10 seconds of rebuttal?
Oh, yeah, sure.
I liked everything they said. Thank you, gentlemen.
Frank Mannheim, School of Government, etc. Obviously, a great interest in your book and in Smith is how it relates to our current political and social problems, where everybody agrees we're in bad shape. People are starting to call us again a new gilded age. So what are the primary lessons that you can offer us the things that one could concentrate on that might change the paradigm. And also, please reflect on the fact that now books really don't count. You could have a book with all the wisdoms that would solve all our problems, and people would look at it, oh, that's interesting, and then put it down until the next book that could solve our problems. So please give us your thoughts on that.
What do we have till about 7:30? Just to try to give a quick answer, and eager to let the other panelists join in as well. That is a big question. I think there's a little bit of romance about Smith and about Softler Gentler, that somehow we need this side of Smith, the theory of moral sentiment side of Smith, to balance the ruthless dog-eat-dog part. I don't think that's a fair interpretation of Smith. I think Smith saw commerce as a very civilizing activity that forces a person in business to be sympathetic to the needs and desires of the customers. So in a world of competition, at least. What I do think is relevant, though, to get to your point about the Gilded Age that we are in, I think it's important to distinguish between how an age gets gilded and which members get gilded in what ways. So I'm really happy that Steve Jobs' wife is really wealthy. It doesn't bother me in the least. And it really does bother me that there are people on Wall Street who are gilded with my money without my choice. I choose to buy an iPhone, and I didn't choose to bail out the banks. And that ability to count on future bailouts seems to me to be very bad for me and good for them. I would also point out that the culture on Wall Street used to be very different. And I write about this in the book. The culture on Wall Street, when bankers were spending their own money, was much more prudent. Imprudence began when the government started bailing out banks and telling them that they could borrow money without any consequences and that people could lend money to those banks without consequences. That's a long story, so I can't do justice to that here. I just want to make that point. The other point I want to make is that, to me, the gildedness of our age is way down on my list of problems. The much bigger problem is the darkness of the lives of many people who are not part of the modern economy, who don't get a good education, who don't have a chance to flourish, whose gifts are not enhanced by those around them. And I think that is our single biggest social problem. That's my personal issue, of course. We all have our own view of what's the biggest problem. But the bottom line is I don't view the failure of a large, tragically large segment of our population to be part of the nexus of commerce and flourishing to come from the success of those at the top, except to the extent that they are crippling our productivity through their rent-seeking and cronyism, which disturbs me greatly. So I don't see them as tied together. I think them as stemming from similar problems, perhaps, but I think if we think about how to make the world a better place, the thing I want to focus on is much more is pushing people up from the bottom, helping people rise, be a better way to say it, than pulling people down, except for those who don't deserve to be up, in which case I wish they hadn't been given that leg up from my pocketbook. You guys want to say anything?
I would just add to this to say I think one of the most fascinating and important parts of Russ's book is its focus on one particular virtue that's very important for our age, if perhaps understated today. And it's the focus on the virtue of humility. Russ comes back again and again. And if one of the questions is, what do we need today and what can Adam Smith give us, both in terms of the doctrines he teaches in his books, as well as the example of the life he lived, one in which the humility to engage with the other side, to sincerely look for answers opposed simply just from ideology, to try and get to the bottom of a question and figure out where you can take wisdom from. That is, it's something that, I don't want to be dogmatic, but it seems in somewhat short supply today, and Russ makes, I think, very helpfully emphasizes that both in Smith and for the need for our own age.
Are you going to say something, Dan? I just want to add my 15-second rebuttal that how much I appreciated the comments. That may have sounded flippant, but I didn't mean it to. I meant it very sincerely. I'm actually, your mention of humility, I'm very humbled by your insights, and I just really appreciated them. And I didn't mean that. I agree with everything you say to make it sound like I was just making a cheap shot or a joke. I meant it very sincerely.
Hi, my name's... Is this thing on? Hello? Hi, my name is Michael Locke. I'm a grad student here at GMU. First, I want to thank you for coming and presenting your book to us. My question has to do with the spectator concept that Smith talks in Moral Sentiments. Is that you mentioned that the spectator is a sort of, I guess, a conceptual idea that we make in our own heads of, okay, if there was this guy sitting on my shoulder, you know, who is an unbiased judge, what would he do in this situation, or what would he think? But you also mentioned the fact that Smith admitted that people are biased by their own paradigms and their circumstances and how they see the world. So who's to say that the spectator himself is not going to be also biased because he's a construction of our reality?
So let me take a crack at that, and I'd like to hear what they have to say as well. But my understanding of Smith is that we create that impartial spectator out of the interactions that we have with the people around us, that we're very much social creatures. He says in the heat of the moment, we're prone to forget about him, push him off to, not just he's at a distance, we push him away. When we're passionate about something, have an appetite for something, see our self-interest very boldly and easily. And then later we reflect on it, we realize, maybe I didn't do the right thing there. So he certainly was aware of the fact that it's an imperfect way to restrain ourselves. I would add that he doesn't talk much about the possibility that you might hang out with some really unattractive people and have, as your impartial spectator, the lessons you've learned from the people around you are not so attractive. His friends were David Hume and Adam Ferguson, and they weren't average people, and they were probably pretty virtuous people, not just really smart. So I think there are limits to the impartial spectator concept as a guide to, say, virtue, but as a way of thinking about how we behave, that we're just on the positive versus normative distinction. On the positive side, the idea that we are the creatures of the interactions that we are able to experience, I think, is a deep truth.
I'll comment on that. Smith's way of speaking of the guy, your invisible friend, is not on your shoulder, but is the man within the breast. He uses that expression quite a bit. And in my reading, it's not the impartial spectator. It's a representative of the impartial spectator. So this representative, this man within your breast, can indeed be way off, as it were, and certainly can conflict with the man in other people's breasts and so on, and that's to be expected. Whereas the impartial spectator, in its highest, richest sense, because there's different sort of levels that particular term is used. I mean, it could be just that, Ralph here, who happens to be present and spectating, is also impartial about, the dispute between the two of us, so he's also an impartial spectator. But in the highest and richest sense, it's a universal being, actually, I believe. This is my reading. Maybe Ryan thinks differently, but we have in our breasts, Smith's urging us to think of our consciences, that's the man in the breast, as representatives of that, and representatives of something which is actually universal, and universal in two senses. First, that this great high impartial spectator is like a great beholder, and what the impartial spectator beholds is pretty much everything that matters, the whole, which could even mean humankind, or even future generations of humankind. And it's also universal in the sense that, in some sense, we're all sort of trying to approach the same universal beholder. If our man in the breast is our conscience, right, then you might ask, okay, what about the man in my breast's conscience? Okay? So we got a conscience of the conscience, right? And the way I like to put it is that in Smith's view, your conscience's conscience is the impartial spectator. And furthermore, your conscience's conscience is the same as my conscience's conscience. So in that sense, it's universal. It's actually the same for all of us. So I kind of would use the term impartial spectator more for this God-like. I see it as very isomorphic to God. And if you think Smith was religious, which I think is an open question, it is God. If you think of him more as like David Hume, it's like sort of like the Humean replacement for God, okay? And I don't think it matters much which way you go with that. So that's my thinking, basic thinking on it. I'd be interested in what you think, Ryan, or what you think, Jerry.
Those are deep waters. I'm not even putting a toe in there.
In the back?
So one thing that comes up often when I read TMS, which I've done, and Wealth of Nations, is rather than the conventional dust atoms problem, a slightly different one, in that in looking at TMS in the sort of way of reading it as a guide to improving one's own life, one of the things that comes out is certainly a notion of one's own flourishing, and right, as Russ said, what makes us sing. And singing, I think, is a peculiar example, because one of the things that I struggle with is reconciling that notion of virtue with the discussion of approbation and disapprobation in occupation that Smith has in Wealth of Nations. And so in particular, right, he refers to, right, opera singers as being one of the things where wages are high because disapprobation is high. And so if what makes us sing is these sort of good things about self-fulfillment and flourishing, it yet seems that society, at least if you were living in Smith's time, was telling you that that was non-virtuous. So in some sense, you could be lovely in the TMS sense, while for doing something that society thought you to be ugly for, and in fact had to pay you more because of its ugliness. And that seems to me to be a tension, and I'd be wondering if the panel could comment on that.
Well, my first thought is that opera singing's come a long way since Smith's time, and that opera singers today, despite the fact that they're struggling in competition with more modern forms of musical expression, are well compensated, not because it's a shameful act, but because it's a rare skill. It's a supply side phenomenon, not a demand side phenomenon. I do think it's an interesting point. You know, you hear a lot about how shameful it is that we don't honor teachers by paying them more. And I think it's just a fundamental understanding of what's going on, but there is a Smithian lesson there. Obviously, say school teachers, not college professors, we're overpaid, by the way, horribly overpaid.
Be quiet.
Yeah, I know, it's a secret, but the reason, and I say that not because our lives are good, I say that because the subsidies to Wall Street that I mentioned earlier, I think, have greatly benefited economists. So when I get depressed about too big to fail and the benefits that the financial sector gets, I always comfort myself with realizing that it's part of the reason my salary is what it is, because universities have to compete to pull us away from Wall Street. I'm still ashamed, but it's some comfort. So when I mention teachers not being paid well, I mean K through 12 teachers. Most people don't think professors are underpaid, but a lot of people think K through 12 teachers are underpaid. And of course, the reason they make less than they otherwise might, at least good ones, is because it's a really glorious thing to be an effective teacher. You get a lot of approbation, actually, or the equivalent of it from your students and your parents. And my wife's a school teacher, and she changes people's lives in ways that I don't, and I think it's just a magnificent and glorious thing. I think the Smithian part of that is that the critics of that payment system do have a point, in that if you're in a profession that is low paid because it is so rewarding non-monetarily, you do fall prey, I think, to the lack of prestige that Smith was very aware of, that people who make more money than others or get more attention. So I think there is a sense in which school teaching is undervalued, right? But I think that's a good system. It pulls in people who are happy to accept a little less prestige at the cocktail party and a little more glory and respect and satisfaction from the people who actually matter, which are their students and their parents.
To add very briefly to that, I suspect that one of the reasons why Smith is such an enthusiast for commercial society is that it makes a variety of different types of good lives possible. Granted, they won't be equally well compensated, but certainly when he looks back into European feudal order, he sees that many of the things that we value today, even if not as well compensated, simply weren't possible before. So the idea that it makes possible a multiplicity of good lives is probably an important part of this conversation, especially when we have a tendency to talk about the good life for Smith. I think Smith was writing about the possibility of a variety of different types of good lives, a way that's very pluralistic and I think in keeping with a number of his commercial commitments.
Yeah, I'll comment on that as well. I think you put your finger on something really fundamental. In fact, was it Hugh Blair who said he was the first edition's on a too conformist, or I forget who the correspondent was. So Smith revised moral sentiments to become more and more clear that he wasn't just saying it's about fitting in, and that it's about developing an independent sense of judgment, developing this man in the breast that's more and more elevated and willing to stand up against opinion, opposing it. I agree with what you're saying about commercial society, but I think it's all part of this political view that those tensions, as you put it, are better worked out in the equal relationship, the you and your neighbor relationship, through the bubbling up, the bottom up spontaneous process that I think Russ referred to today. Then when they're determined or constrained or influenced greatly by the governor-governed relationship. So, throughout TMS, not throughout, but in several places in TMS, he's telling us that the invisible hand in morals works better in the equal relationship than it does in the superior-inferior relationship. And so we should have social affairs organized more along the equal relationship lines so that those tensions that you're bringing up kind of more play out in a more healthy manner, is the way I would put it.
This question is for Ryan. You read out a passage in which Smith says that virtue is really hard to acquire. You have to know yourself and understand human nature and be a keen observer of human affairs and understand how institutions work. Then does he draw the logical conclusion that given that most people don't have the interest or the time or the ability to do that, they're not going to be virtuous?
The conclusion he draws is that most people won't be perfectly wise and virtuous. And this is important. One of the things Smith wants to induce in all of us, even those who aspire to perfect wisdom and virtue, is the likelihood of how far short we're going to fall, given the fact that we are flawed human beings, as Russ introduced. So one of the wonderful things about the aspiration for perfect wisdom and virtue and all that hard work is that not only does one become a little bit better than one was, but one also realizes how short one comes and of that perfect ideal and just how much like everyone else one is. So one of the best parts of his image of falling short of perfect wisdom and virtue is that it culminates in a real respect for other human beings who are equally flawed no matter how high and mighty one thinks one is. You have just as many challenges as others. So even that aspiration, even all that hard work culminates in something that looks like a recognition, to use one of Smith's favorite phrases. 3 times in the book he uses this one locution to recognize that we are, quote, just one of the multitude, no better than any other in it. That's an important thing for those who would believe themselves high and mighty to learn, Smith thinks.
I think we have time for one more question. Justin Merrill.
Is there any part of TMS that you might disagree with the moral philosophy? One of the most common criticisms is the reliance on sympathy, and how in practice that sometimes has a dark side where maybe CNN will focus on the little girl that fell down the well, but children that die in a war zone are just a statistic. There's other, real world examples of that, but I think maybe was the Impartial Spectator an attempt to overcome that, but I don't know. What do you think?
When I heard the first part of the question about things that I disagree with in Smith, I was going to mention his view on makeup. Smith never married. He lived with his mom much of his life, and he viewed makeup as a bizarre thing because you'd be admired for your beauty that it wasn't really yours. You'd appear to be lovely in the physical sense, but you'd actually be deceiving people. And so I think we can be pretty sure that Smith would not be taking doing any plastic surgery in our era, taking steroids or other things like it. But you raise an interesting point. I'm not sure. I hadn't thought about it. I think we are prone to those emotional overreactions. We are prone to put our sympathy in louder places that get our attention than in quieter places. And I think other than the self-awareness in the passage that Ryan quoted, I think I'd say that's our best bet for keeping things in the proper perspective. I think Smith would have urged us to do that in a world where information's bombarding us and flashier things grab our attention, not just more emotional things.
Unfortunately, I think that's going to have to be the last word. I want to join me again in thanking Russ, Ryan, and Dan for coming out tonight and sharing their ideas with us. I'd like to also thank again Claire Morgan and Justin Hayes and the staff at Mercatus for doing all the hard work that they do here, and also to thank you for taking the time out from your schedules to join us this afternoon. We will have another book panel similar to this in February 19th featuring David Scarbeck's recent book published by Oxford University Press called The Social Order of the Underworld, which actually won the top book in criminal justice for 2014 as well. And so I hope you will join us for that. That will be in a different room, Hub, I think, ballroom, HUB ballroom or whatever, and also at 2 o'clock to 3:30. But other than that, thank you again, guys. It's great, very stimulating. I hope it's a great way to start the semester. Thank you.